Hey everyone, in the last video, we spoke about all of the lies and manipulation that Zohran Mamdani has engaged in during his campaign for mayor of New York City. But today, I really want to start talking about numbers. What will it actually cost New York and New Yorkers? Let's take a look at what the pillars of his campaign are.
Here is what we stand for, my friends. We are going to freeze the rent for more than 2 million rent-stabilized tenants and use every resource at our disposal to build housing for everyone who needs it. We are going to eliminate the fare on every single bus line and make what are currently the slowest buses in the nation move around this city with ease. And we are going to create universal childcare at no cost to parents.
Zohran is making some really big promises to New Yorkers of rent freeze, free buses, and free childcare. Well, nobody has seemed to ask him, what does this cost and how does this work? So I dug in myself because I have lived in New York City since 2013, back when Bloomberg was the mayor of New York City. I lived through de Blasio as mayor, Adams as mayor, and now, unfortunately, will be living through Zohran Mamdani as mayor. And I think we need to take a look at our past to understand where we're at now, and we also need to look at the budget. So the first pillar of Mamdani's big promises is rent freeze. He wants to freeze the rent for 2 million rent-stabilized apartment units in New York City. This is not new, although people that are supporting him seem to think this is groundbreaking, and people are so in love with this concept. But it really goes to show that most people that are supporting him for this freeze the rent campaign are people that are not from New York. Because if you have lived in New York City long enough, you would know that the rent has been frozen over many times before. For example, under Bill de Blasio, he froze the rent entirely 3 separate times. Sure, the idea of freezing the rent for people is a great one. I would personally love my rent to be frozen, although we need to take a closer look at what actually happens as a cause and effect of this policy. Over those 3 years of rent freezing under de Blasio, small-time landlords forfeited over $1 billion. And something that the same people that support people like Mamdani seem to complain about is this influx of PE and luxury firm buyouts of small apartment buildings in New York City. And they don't really stop to wonder why this is happening or how this is happening. Really, they just stick a hand up against the man and say, this is against the people. But what's really happening is landlords that are owning units of less than 10 at a time, which would be considered a small-time landlord, are unable to afford the maintenance and renovations required to keep up with the market. And therefore, they are being pushed to sell or foreclose their buildings, which are being grabbed up by these PE and luxury firms. So this is just a straightforward cause and effect of what happens when an owner of a small building cannot afford to manage it anymore. We are seeing New York City in a housing market emergency, meaning that we are technically under the limit of having less than 5% vacancies across the city. These low vacancy rates are also a leading cause of price hikes across the board. That's why we are seeing average apartment rates of a 1-bedroom being around $4,100 a month compared to around $2,000 in 2015. Throughout 2015 to 2022, we saw that landlord operating costs have increased 40%. So this goes to show again that if you cannot charge at the market rate, but your costs are raising due to inflation and other policies pushed by someone like de Blasio, then you are kind of forced to turn your hand and sell. It really doesn't require that much exploration to really see how many new builds in New York City are being built by luxury firms. The way you can tell is that things are built really poorly. Instead of having small-time landlords have personal investment in the maintenance of their properties, you're just getting bought out by PE firms and being sold $4,100 a month one-bedroom apartments with closet doors made of plywood. Just last year, in 2024, 27,000 stabilized units, rent stabilized units, were accounted for as being vacant but unavailable, meaning that landlords are not renovating to keep them up to standards because they can't afford to. So we have someone like Mamdani who wants to freeze the rent. It's not going to change anything for these units that are technically rent stabilized, but nobody can live in them anyways. The other problem, which has been a long time effect of rent freezing and rent stabilization, is that 40% of all stabilized tenants in New York City have stayed in place for over 20 years. So what does this mean? This means that units that are being rented out much, much lower than the market standard are being hogged, are being passed from generation to generation, actually, and they're not being opened up for new tenants over time. This is a really low turnover rate for rent-stabilized units.
I'm 29 years old. I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in a 2-bedroom apartment, and I pay $1,300 a month in rent. So I live in a rent-stabilized apartment, which is why it's so low in cost. This exact apartment, a couple floors up, went 2 years ago, I believe, for $38,000. I think my friends just look at me in disbelief and then roll their eyes. So my mom was also a teacher, so that's the reason that they got this apartment, and then they hung on to it for me because they knew it would be just such a great deal for me.
And just to throw one more statistic in there, 1 in 8 stabilized units have been sold to institutional buyers since 2020, and they were all deregulated. So 1 of 8 were deregulated, meaning that once they were bought and redone, they were no longer required to be rent stabilized. Do you see the problem here? So before we move on to his next pillar of free buses, let's just total out what the cost of this rent freeze initiative would be annually. We are seeing an average cost annually of around $1.3 billion. So keep that in mind, as at the end of this, we will total everything together to understand if his tax reforms would even cover the costs of all of these pillars.
Together, New York, we're gonna make buses fast and...
So the next big thing on his agenda that people have been loving is the idea of free buses in New York City. I find so ironic as somebody who actually takes the bus in New York City and who has lived here since 2013, because you will notice that most people that get on the bus are already evading fares with no punishment. The drivers can't really do anything about it. No one says anything about it. It happens constantly. And the thing is that people that really are getting behind this free bus movement are definitely people that do not take the bus in New York and don't need to take the bus in New York, because they would know that this really is not going to have much of an impact, considering so many people already don't pay for the bus. And let me give you some numbers here, because this, honestly, I knew that it would be pretty high in evasion numbers considering what I see when I take the bus, but this was just confirming this whole thought. This was just even more confirming than I expected. So in 2024, we saw actual revenues of around $680 million, but the projected revenues were meant to be much higher. And the reason that this actualized revenue is only $680 million is because there is a 47% evasion rate. 47%. So that's around $568 million that has been lost to fare evasion. So that has not been actualized in the real revenue rather than the projected revenue. So as I said, almost 50% of people don't pay for the bus already. Buses in New York City account for 60% of all of the MTA's complete evasion losses annually. So we are seeing the most amount of evasion happening on these buses compared to the subway and trains. And Zoran has really been pushing this agenda because in 2023, over the year of 2023 through 2024, he piloted this really tiny concept of free buses along 5 routes, okay? He made the buses free and it increased a ridership of around like 30%. But the other pinnacle of his campaign is that he wants to make buses much faster and more efficient.
And make what are currently the slowest buses in the nation move around this city with ease.
Yet in his pilot, there were markedly slower busing considering the lines for the buses were much longer and there was no technology or infrastructure upgrades to accommodate this. So these buses were actually much slower than they would have been if they were not free. He also says that in order to make buses faster in New York City, he wants to upgrade bus priority lanes. He wants to install new cameras to enforce these lanes and hire more DOT officers. So let's take a look at what the breakdown costs of all of that would be. First of all, I do want to point out that we already have 200 miles of bus priority lanes in New York City. Again, as someone who lives in New York City, I see this myself when I take the bus. We have bus priority lanes on almost every major avenue in this city. So if the problem is enforcement, then there's going to need to be a lot of infrastructure upgrades and technology upgrades across the board. Based on all of the upgrades that he would need to increase the average bus speed from 7.8 miles per hour to over 11 miles per hour, he would need to spend around $800 million on cameras to enforce these lanes, new technology for creating priority lanes, priority turn signals, hiring more DOT and NYPD traffic officers to enforce these lanes as well. So we're seeing $800 million, and we would also be eating up the $680 million that would have been revenue from bus fares. So we could just round that out to be about $1.4 billion annually in cost. And, you know, we'll just consider this the first year, considering that maybe once you make these upgrades, it'll be a lower cost over time, but the fare revenues would be consistent over all years. But let's just mark this at $1.4 billion. So we're seeing free buses at $1.4 billion of an investment and rent freezes at $1.3 billion of investment.
And we are going to create universal childcare at no cost to parents.
The last piece of his campaign is about creating and offering free childcare for every single family in New York City, regardless of income. And this would apply to children that are from 6 weeks to 5 years old. So that makes that about 300 to 350,000 children. Again, this is something that Zoran, first of all, cannot accomplish on his own, and he needs approval from the state. So that would mean Hochul. And he doesn't acknowledge this really much in his speeches because people don't really care if he accomplishes any of this. It's all rhetoric to make it seem like we all care so much about every single person, even though in reality, this is going to impact the people that are already suffering the most. As I will show you later on, we have seen incredible increases in crime and homelessness. Anyways, when it comes to free childcare, what does this cost us? Out of the 3 pillars of his campaign that we've discussed so far, this is definitely the most expensive, coming in at $8.5 billion annually. So why is that so expensive? Well, first of all, in order to accomplish something like this, Zoran would need a ton of funding from Albany, and Albany controls around 70% of all state tax money. So he would clearly need to have a very strong relationship and be very persuasive in getting them to hand over this kind of money for free childcare that would only be in New York City, so it would not be in Albany. Regardless, if he were able to push something like this through, he would need to hire thousands of more teachers, and he also pledges to pay them much more than they already have been being paid, along with childcare workers that will have increases to their salaries too. They would also need to build tons of new schools and daycare centers that we currently do not have. Meals, toys, insurance, and technology for enrollments. There would have to be waitlist maintenances. There would have to be administration costs. We're seeing tons of money needing to be poured into this. So even if we round down to about $6 billion, this is still the most expensive initiative out of the 3. So just for context, NYPD budget in New York City is $6 billion. So this would outweigh and cost even more than the NYPD budget, which I'm not really sharing an opinion on. This is just a matter of numbers. But what I will say is that Mamdani, when we look at all of these things together, he will be needing around $8.59 billion per year on top of the funding that we already generate in New York City in order to accomplish these three things. This means that he's pledging to spend over 3 times more than de Blasio had under his tenure. And de Blasio, in case people just don't remember, or maybe again, they were not living in New York City at the time, de Blasio left office with a lower than 30% approval rating, which is one of the lowest of all time for New York City mayors. He failed. Between 2015 and 2022, when de Blasio was mayor of New York City, homelessness increased 115%. He defunded the NYPD by $1 billion. He lost 2,000 cops. Crime spiked. In fact, Adams won the campaign because he just campaigned on fighting crime. Crime was so high at the time. He also said he was going to fix deeply rooted segregation within schools, public schools and charter schools. He failed to deliver on that. De Blasio also promised that he would fight homelessness. He did end up spending $3 billion a year, and still street homelessness went up 80%. Shelters just are not the same thing as actual housing, and we also cannot function in this false reality that by just providing housing or shelter to a homeless person will rehabilitate them enough to function within society and not end up back on the street. I digress. He also failed to deliver on his BQE reconstruction plan. He invested $4 billion for this plan. It was delayed over 10 years. He spent $1 billion on the Thrive Mental New York City Health Initiative, which, as somebody who has a very severely mentally ill father, I think that, his heart's in the right place. But again, you can't do these things without, 1, having a plan, 2, understanding cause and effect, and 3, finding funding from outside of just the top 1% of earners in New York City. The top 1% of earners in New York City already account for over 44%, yes, 44% of all tax in New York City, actually in New York State. So the 1% top earners in New York City account for over 40% of all tax funding throughout the entire state. So the more and more that we tax them, and the more and more that they flee New York, the less funding there is to work with, and yet we are seeing more and more funding needed by people like Zohran Mamdani. Let's take a look at his actual tax reform plans. He wants to increase the flat tax on all income over $1 million by 2%. So this goes from 3.87% to 5.87%. What this means for people that make over $1 million a year is that for combined state and city taxes, they will see a rate of 16.8%, which is literally the highest in the entire country. He also wants to raise corporate taxes from 7.25 to 11.5%. And for each of these, he would only get in return around $4 billion each. So again, with free childcare, free buses, and rent freezing, not to mention his 200,000 new units that he wants to build, he is not covered by the tax reform, actually, that he's putting forward. He would need to find money elsewhere. And this is not to mention that he also needs to get a lot of this funding from Kathy Hochul. So it's not entirely up to him, and yet he keeps making these promises and people believe him. When we see people making $1 million or more a year being taxed at the highest rate across the entire country, you can expect most of them to eventually leave. They are really actually the backbone of the entire tax pool. When we look at over 40% of the total being funded by these people, they're really not getting much credit for it. And I don't think they're really reaping any of the benefits either. With this increase of homelessness and crime, with the increasing rent rates, which happens because we are in a housing crisis where we do not have enough vacancies because We have so many rent stabilized apartments that people are not leaving. And then there's only a limited supply of apartments that are in the free market, and they can price each other out constantly. So just to tie this all back together, Zoran and Bernie and AOC got on this stage, spoke so passionately about every racial group except for white people, spoke down on billionaires and millionaires, and yet the agenda that Zoran Mamdani is pushing forward requires more money in the billions than even would be achievable through these tax reforms. He needs more money than we spend on the NYPD. He needs more money from corporations and millionaires, and yet speaks as if they are the devil. As somebody who has lived here for 13 years, I can specifically remember how much more affordable this place was when Bloomberg was mayor. Nothing has improved since then, and we already saw a Mamdani 1.0 with Bill de Blasio. I'm not a millionaire. I would say I'm middle class. And I plan on leaving New York City because it's way too expensive. But you don't see me huffing and puffing around saying, make shit free for me so I can stay here. This is not how the world works. We go where we can afford to live. We've tried every trick in the book over the past decade in New York City to try to help everyone that lives here. And let's not even mention all of the migrants that we brought in during COVID. We have tried everything, and it has shown us time and time again that when you don't take in cause and effect, you plan merely for the short-term gains, and then people act surprised when the outcomes over the long term are actually really detrimental. It's similar to how people thought during COVID, where they were so concerned about saving immediate lives that they didn't think about any of the long-term effects, which honestly, many of these effects can be contributed to that too. We are living in a generation, I suppose, of just me's and right nows. There is no foresight, there's no patience, there's no understanding of short-term and long-term effects in the economy, and this is what we end up with. Someone who makes a lot of beautiful, cheery, nice equality promises, who lies and gets away with it, and knows that he doesn't have the autonomy to do a lot of these things on his own, but says that he will. So I really hope that New York remembers this. I really hope this is the last time we need to deal with something like this. I thought de Blasio was bad enough, but clearly not. So just remind people that vote for Zoran to look back at this 5 years from now. And when things go miserably wrong, remind them of what they should have seen so that they don't make this mistake again.